Welcome to episode 1 in my Piano to Orchestra series. Today I'll be orchestrating a 4-voice piano chorale for orchestra. Before I begin, I just want to mention that for just $5 a month, you can get all of the MIDI and music XML files for these orchestration videos, as well as all future composition and music tutorials. Check out the link to my Patreon page in the description below for more information. Okay, let's get started. I'll start by playing the piano piece for this episode. So this short piece is a 10-measure 4-voice or 4-part chorale in F major. The term 4-voice chorale just means that there are 4 distinct voice parts or individual lines in the texture. When I use the term voice, I simply refer to an individual line within the texture, like a melody or bass line or an inner voice part. Historically, these were sung, hence the terms voice and chorale. And the standard 4-voice chorale has a soprano, alto, tenor, and bass part. J.S. Bach and other Baroque composers wrote 4-part keyboard chorales, many of which are great for studying counterpoint and music theory. So when writing this piece, I made sure to have the top line be somewhat interesting melodically, as well as the bass line. If you look at both of these lines, there aren't a lot of adjacent repeating notes, and there are clear melodic shapes, meaning the notes have a clear direction in each phrase, as opposed to just meandering around. The middle 2 parts, however, are less interesting horizontally speaking, and these notes are simply filling out the harmony. So how is all of this important when orchestrating? Well, I think the more you understand about the music, the more easily you'll be able to orchestrate effectively. Before we orchestrate this for full orchestra, let's start by placing these parts into an orchestral string section. I'll just copy and paste each line into the correct instrument, and here's what that gets us. I'd like to point out all of the issues with a copy and paste arrangement here. First, there are a few out of range notes in the cello part, so we'll have to either bump these notes up the octave or transpose the piece up. In this case, we'd have to transpose up a minor third because there's a low A in measure 8, and the lowest note on the cello is a C, a minor third above. So here's what that would look like. We're now in A flat major, and all of the notes are playable for every instrument. So how do you know whether to transpose the entire key upwards or to simply adjust individual notes and stay in the original key? Well, that's sort of a tough call, and it's largely subjective. I've heard a few people say that it's best to transpose music for piano up by a few semitones when orchestrating to prevent muddiness in the low register. On the other hand, if you're arranging someone else's music, then changing the original key might be frowned upon, as many composers are attached to how certain keys sound, or even what certain keys represent symbolically. If you're simply arranging your own piano music or sketches for orchestra, then my advice is to try a bunch of keys, and just because you sketched or wrote something in the key of F, for instance, doesn't mean that it sounds best or works best in F. Let's, however, return to the original key of F and discuss how we'd proceed from there. With 4 distinct parts and 5 instrumental parts, we have to figure out what to do with the basses now. Right now they're empty, but of course, they could be given those low notes that are out of range for the cello. Oftentimes, the basses will double cello parts, either at pitch or an octave lower. So if I copy-paste the cello part into the bass part, we have this. Just to remind you, basses sound an octave lower than written, so as it is now, the cello and basses are in unison. Some of these notes are really high for basses, not unplayable, but probably not appropriate for this music. So now we have to decide where to bump down the octave. You could also choose to leave basses out for some of this piece and only bring them in when necessary. If I went that route, I might decide to bring them in on the pickups to measure 5, then drop them down the octave going into measure 7. I think this works well from a structural standpoint because in measure 5 we sort of repeat the opening melodic gesture. So I think it's a good place to balance having something familiar, i.e. melody, with something new, i.e. bass line and orchestration. So once I add the basses, I'll then adjust the cello part up the octave where necessary. Now all 5 sections have notes in an effective range throughout. So what are some other issues with the copy-paste arrangement? What about slurs and bowings? The only slurs in the piano version were in the top voice on 8th and 16th notes. I've already discussed string bowings in a few of my fundamentals of orchestration videos, so check those out if you're confused about string bowings and articulations. I'm not going to try all the different phrasing possibilities, so you have to decide how connected you want these notes to be. I think I want them to be fairly connected, so I'll add the following slurs. I could also decide to have measure 1 divided into 2 slurs. That would have worked as well. Rebowing is sort of like enunciating the metrical beat, so if you want more rhythmic pulse, then add more bowings. Also, at louder dynamics, it's best to add bow changes more frequently because each bowing will actually use more of the bow in each direction to produce a louder sound. Okay, one other thing I need to fix now. Within a slur, any repeated notes, I'll just combine like this. These notes could be in fact separated under one slur. You just add tenuto markings to indicate portato bowing, but that's not what I want here. I want to show this process in Cubase now, as it's different from Dorico and a bit more challenging. I've extracted the individual lines from the piano MIDI and given them to the appropriate instrument. In most sample libraries, you need to connect adjacent notes to trigger the legato bowing, so I'll go ahead and do that for the first 2 measures in each part. In cases where the notes repeat within a phrase, I'll delete all but the first one and extend that first note to the end. Let's give this a listen. In many sample libraries with legato articulations, you'll need to move the connected notes to the left to compensate for the legato transition time. In each library, the amount you move to the left is a bit different, but for Berlin strings, this is about where I need to move them. I've also shortened beat 4 in measure 1 and beat 3 in measure 2 so that you can better hear the phrasing. The last thing that I want to do here is adjust the dynamics via CC1 or the modulation wheel. Even though the notation says that these measures are all piano dynamics, we need to try and recreate what performers would naturally do, that is, add some dynamic phrasing. How you go about this depends entirely on the library that you're using and how that library was programmed. Many people also use CC11 or MIDI expression to exaggerate the dynamic phrasing. I'll admit that I tend not to bother with this, but a lot of really talented sample library users say that it's necessary. There are a ton of other things to consider when working with MIDI and sample libraries, but I'll save that for future videos. So let's hear the full string version now, after I've adjusted the phrasing and dynamics for the entire 10 measures. I'd like to take a look at a few simple changes I can make to improve this arrangement. First, I'll change the phrasing in measure 1, 5, and 7. Measures 1 and 5 now have rebowings on beat 3, and measure 7 now has rebowings in beats 2 and 4. This helps to accentuate the rhythm and allows the players to crescendo more easily. I've also thickened the voicings just a bit with a few divisi chords in measures 6, 8, and 10. The most significant one here is in measure 8, as I really tried to reinforce the upper notes by filling in some of the harmonies. A few adjustments here and there, and I think this version is a bit better than the last. So let's add the rest of the orchestra. I'll first copy these strings exactly as they are into a new version in Dorico, this time with the other instrument staves available. Here's what my empty score layout looks like. In addition to the strings, I've decided to have 2 flutes, 2 oboes, 2 clarinets, 2 bassoons, 4 horns, 3 trumpets, 2 tenor trombones, a bass trombone, a tuba, and timpani. For the first version, I'll have winds, brass, and strings playing throughout. I'll start by copying and pasting these lines into the woodwinds. I'll give the melody to the oboes and flutes. I think oboes need to be on this melody because they won't really sound good on the lower parts. It gets too low for them. And flutes won't work on any of the lower parts either, so we have to bump flutes up the octave or keep them in unison with oboes. I'll keep them in unison for now. That leaves 3 more lines to give to 2 clarinets and 2 bassoons. Clarinets will blend nicely in the background with the violin 2 part, and then we can give the viola part to the first bassoon and the cello part to the second bassoon. I know what I've done isn't exactly balanced throughout this woodwind section, but perhaps we can compensate when we orchestrate the brass. It's a very basic orchestration so far, but it's not bad, it's just not that exciting. Let's go ahead and add in brass now. It's really easy to overdo it with brass, so instead of having everyone play the entire time, I'll hold off on bringing in trumpets and low brass until the 3rd phrase. I think otherwise it would be too heavy from the start. Horns will blend more easily with winds and strings in this softer texture to start, so I'll give them the middle voice material. I'll then bring in trumpets doubling on the melody and give trombones and tubas the cello and bass music. Lastly, let's add a few timpani notes just to emphasize 1 or 2 important moments, maybe some grace notes leading into this climactic moment. Okay, so here's a very basic full orchestra version. Nothing very exciting here, a lot of doublings, but it's a good place to start. Let's hear how it sounds. So now I'll make another version, and this time I want to create a bigger contrast between the soft and loud moments. I'll accomplish this by adding a few more instruments and expanding the register. Let's start from scratch here in the woodwinds. Here's the flute part for the last version. I'd like to expand the register upwards starting here. I'll just bump this up the octave. I'll double this part in the second flute, although on this big climactic chord, I'll move the second flute down a third as I did in the last version. So I'll keep the oboes in unison with flutes initially, but then adjust them going into the 5th measure. Instead of doubling down the octave, I want to fill in this register. So I'll basically copy something very similar to that violin 2 part, but obviously up the octave from where that was. I also know that I want to land on the A below the flute 2, so I can sort of plan the rest of this oboe 1 part accordingly, using somewhat decent voice leading. I'll do the same for the second oboe, and I'll make sure to land on the F below the first oboe in measure 8. Both of these lines are essentially just taking those original four-voice parts and bumping them up the octave, with slight adjustments. I'm not adding any new harmony notes. Okay, so in the clarinets, I'll start with what they had in the previous version, but going into measure 5, I'd like to double the melody at the original octave. So this would be an octave below the flutes now. Then going into measure 9, they'll return to what they had in the previous version. I can also give some notes to the English horn here. I want them to fit underneath the clarinets going into measure 5, so I'll take the first oboe part and bring it down the octave. To stay underneath the clarinets, I'll take the second oboe part here in measure 7 down the octave. And I'll give them this A in measure 8 just below the second clarinet. Also, I'll get the piccolo involved here just during this climactic phrase. I'll take the flute 1 part up the octave. For the low winds, I'll start by copying the previous version of the bassoon parts. I've made a few adjustments, mostly making room for bass clarinet and contrabassoon. I'll add the bass clarinet right below the second bassoon part. Keep in mind I'm viewing this score in concert pitch, so that's why we have all these ledger lines. And lastly, I'll bring in the contrabassoon into measure 5, down the octave. Before moving on, I should say that this orchestration in the woodwinds certainly isn't the only option, or even necessarily the best option. Most of these orchestration choices could be made differently, and the most important thing is that you know how each instrument sounds in each register and at each dynamic. If, for example, you decide that you want flutes on the melody in the upper octave, well then, in order to have a full forte sound, you probably want either clarinets or oboes just below them. Then, depending on what you choose, you have the other instruments to deal with. It's sort of a chain reaction of decisions throughout the entire section once you make that first one. So I'll add in brass now, starting with the trumpets. I'll bring them in on the melody going into measure 5 again. And the only thing that I'll adjust is this climactic chord in measure 8. Now I'll bring in the horns and I'll just copy and paste the clarinet and bassoon 1 parts for the first 4 measures. I'm not going to have them double trumpets on this melody as it would get really high for them, so I'll just position them below the trumpets in measure 5 through 8. One trick I use for figuring out what notes to give these instruments is to determine where they're going first. In other words, it's easier to figure out what notes to give them on this climactic chord in measure 8, and then work backwards to give them a line with good voice leading, or with a nice contour leading up to measure 8. So I'll give the first horn in A, doubling trumpet 3. I think this A is in a good range for a forte horn note. If I wanted a fortissimo sound, I might give the first horn that D above, but that's not what I'm going for here. So then I'll position the remaining horns below that A. I could certainly choose to have horns 1 and 2 on the A, and horns 3 and 4 on the F. That would be fine, but giving each of them a different note is just as effective. So then I'll pick notes for each of these horn parts that stay below the trumpets. And get us to measure 8, it's okay to switch between having 2 and 4 horn notes if you've got a good reason to. I do that occasionally here, just because of which notes are available in the range that fit the harmony. For instance, I have 2 first inversion chords in measure 6 beat 4 and measure 7 beat 1, and I want to avoid overusing the 3rd scale degree in the middle and upper registers. In a 3-note chord, I then only have 2 remaining note options for 4 horns, so that's why I go from 4 notes to 2, and then back to 4 going into measure 8. Okay, on to low brass. I'll start by adding in the tuba part. I'll copy this over from contrabassoon and then adjust up the octave where I think necessary. Tuba can get a bit muddy in the lowest octave, so for this type of music I think it's better to reserve that lowest octave for contrabassoon and basses. So once I determine the tuba notes, I'm just going to fit the trombones somewhere in between tuba and horns registrally. I can overlap a bit with the low horns if I like, but I'll keep the tenor trombones inside or just above the bass clef staff, and bass trombone towards the middle or bottom of the bass clef staff. So now in the strings, I'll keep the first 4 measures the same as the last version. But going into measure 5, I want to do sort of what I did with the upper winds. I'll bump them up the octave to expand the range, thus creating a fuller, more dynamic overall sound. This might also be a good time for divisi upper strings. That will allow me to fill in these registers with notes more easily. I'll start this gesture by having the first violins sort of in octaves with the second violins enclosed within that octave. It's not the only way to organize these pitches, just an option that I use quite frequently. I'll then place violas below the violins registrally, and I decided to reinforce the melody going into measure 7 with violas an octave below violin 1s. Onto the low strings, basses have basically the same octave as the contrabassoon, and celli are between basses and violas, sort of occupying the same register as the horns. And finally, I'll just add some very simple, basic percussion. The timpani part from before with an added rolled note at the end, and a bass drum and suspended cymbal. These are mainly there to just highlight and reinforce the climactic measure 8 material. Okay, so let's hear how this sounds when we put everything together. There's a more impressive climactic sound in this version, and the contrast between the softest moment and the loudest moment is much greater. I'm sure with just a few more changes I could make that climactic moment even bigger, and that might involve changing keys entirely so that the instruments are playing in their strongest registers in measure 8. I'd like to try just one more version. This time I'll focus on a smaller, more intimate sound. I don't necessarily need everyone playing all the time, and it might be interesting to try alternating between sections. For instance, starting with woodwinds, then shifting to a woodwind and string texture. I'll also experiment a bit more with register. Like density or number of instruments, I don't always need a full register. Sometimes just having the instruments up in the high registers is effective. So once again, I'll start with an empty score. I'm showing this original piano version as a reference. I've chosen to make this version in D flat, that's a major third below the original. I want to open with clarinets on the melody, and I think it will be a bit warmer timbrally down a third from the original. I experimented with a few different keys, and I thought D flat worked really well. So here's the opening 2 phrases in woodwinds. Clarinets on the melody, bassoons on the middle voices, and bass clarinet on the lowest voice. That is until measure 3 when bassoon 2 and bass clarinet swap parts. I wanted bass clarinet to have the moving 8th notes on beat 4. Timbrally, I liked how that blended with B-flat clarinets above. Next, I added background horns to this texture. They'll blend nicely with woodwinds. Lastly, I'll double the bass voice with tuba. At a piano dynamic in the middle of the bass clef staff, tuba has a rounded, warm timbre that will blend nicely with horns. I'm going for that warm, rounded sound. That's why I chose clarinets, low winds, horns, and tuba. So that's all I want on the opening 2 phrases. Next, I'll move up in register to create a textural shift. I also want to shift from a warm sound to a colder, more fragile sound. I think oboes will work nicely on this next phrase. Oboe 1 and 2 are doubling on the melody, and I give English horn a sort of combination of the 2nd and 4th voices from the chorale. I want a much thinner texture here, so I'm combining a few of the chorale voices into one. The end result when I do this is some interesting counterpoint with larger leaps. I'll add the flutes on sustaining notes in measure 6 just for supporting harmony. Next, I'll add strings with a sol tasto bowing to fit that fragile, delicate sound that I want at this moment. As I was writing these violin parts, I really liked the counterpoint between violins 1 and 2 in measure 6 here, and I think it wouldn't be the same with the lower strings playing. So I decided to briefly remove viola and cello here. I think it sort of works texturally with my goal of a fragile and delicate sound. I'll add back in the cello and viola for the climactic phrase. I'm using a much higher register than the original, but I think it works. Back to the winds, the flutes will take over the melody alongside the violins, And oboes, clarinets, and first bassoon will have the lower voices at the same register as strings. So everything in winds and strings here is shifted up an octave from that original piano version. It should sound a lot brighter. Finally, in that last phrase, I spread out the register to resolve the tension caused by the high, fragile texture that I created. I want to return to a warmer sound, so I'll add back in the low winds, as well as horns and low strings. Overall, there's a much greater registral shape to this version, and the density of the texture changes quite a bit. I don't get quite as big or as dense as the previous version, but that wasn't the goal here. Ultimately, I think I achieve a more intimate sound by using fewer instruments. So here's what this version sounds like. So that's all for this video. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you liked the video, please consider supporting me on Patreon. The MIDI files, music XML files, audio stems, Dorico file, and Cubase file for this video are available on my Patreon now. And if you'd like to submit your own orchestration of this chorale, you can become a Platinum tier Patreon member and I'll offer my feedback in the form of a personalized video. I'd be very curious to see all of the different versions of this piece you could create. I challenge you to try and make a fortissimo climactic moment, or perhaps an even smaller, more intimate version than what I did. So stay tuned for the next video in this series very soon. See you then.